The first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers record Israel's final 20 days at Mount Sinai before they leave that mountain and travel through the wilderness to the promised land. And these opening chapters, they are great. They are optimistic. They are positive. Israel's camp is described like a Garden of Eden in the desert. Yahweh's presence is at the center of their camp, and every narrative is just a further description of the words of Yahweh and Israel's obedience to the words of Yahweh. But that's not the case for the next section in the book of Numbers, chapters 11 to 21. Each of the narratives here are introduced not by the words of God, but rather by the words of men. And we're going to find out rather quickly that when the people speak, you don't want to listen to them. It's not a good thing. Take a look here. Now remember, in Numbers 1 through 10, all of the narratives are introduced by Yahweh said to Moses, and then Moses obeyed the commandment of Yahweh, and everything was wonderful. They obeyed Yahweh 7 times over. But turn the page to chapter 11, and we open up with a narrative right out of the gate where the people are complaining. And then again, the second narrative in chapter 11, the people weep out loud and say, remember how wonderful life was in Egypt when we were slaves. Miriam and Aaron, Moses' siblings, are going to speak against him. Now, this focus on the faithless words of Israel, this is solidified by another pattern. When the people speak, Yahweh is listening. He is paying attention to every faithless word they speak. It says that the Lord heard it and his anger was kindled. When the people wept aloud, Moses heard it. And then the anger of Yahweh spoke, and it says, why have you wept in the hearing of Yahweh? Following Moses and Aaron's kind of rebellion against Moses, it says that Yahweh heard it and his anger was kindled. And then here in chapter 14, when the people grumble against Moses again, Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, I have heard the grumblings of this people, which they grumble in my hearing. And then finally, the rebellion of Korah in chapter 16, Moses heard it and he fell on his face in dejection. Well, the words of Israel clearly are not words of blessing at this point, like Aaron's words, but rather they are words of rebellion. And this is a rebellion which is arranged here in these chapters into a chiasm, where the outer stories match, and then another bracket of stories matching, leading up to a center narrative. Now take a look at how this chiasm is arranged. Both the first and the last rebellion narrative here are general narratives. They're very short, much shorter than the narratives in the middle. And in each case, the rebellion is responded to. The judgment in this case is a judgment of fire, where it says in these opening verses of chapter 11 that Yahweh sent fire and it consumed a part of the camp. And then in chapter 21, Yahweh sent fiery serpents. And in both cases, Moses is going to intercede and pray for the people. If we go in one story to chapter 11 and 20, we see the people are going to demand food and they're going to demand water. And notice in both cases, they're going to point back to their experience, their longing for the days of Egypt. Take a look at this. I want you to see this comparison. So notice how we have this 7 rebellion chiasm here in these chapters. And look specifically at chapters 11 and 20, where after they demand food and water, they're going to point back to their time in Egypt, and they're going to start rattling off all of these fruits and vegetables. And remember how great the cucumbers were? Oh, I love cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. And then jump down to chapter 20, and they say, why did you bring us out of Egypt to this evil place? For here there is no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates like we had back in Egypt. So clearly these stories are linked together. And then we go one narrative in to rebellion C, and they're both a rebellion against leaders, where initially we have Miriam and Aaron rebelling against the leadership of Moses, and then the sons of Korah are going to rebel against the priesthood here in chapter 16. And then at the very center, let's spend a little bit of time here on the center rebellion narrative, chapters 13 and 14. This is a rebellion against the Exodus itself. So, in the beginning of chapter 13, Moses is going to send 12 spies into the land of Canaan, and those spies are going to come back with a bad report. At least 10 of them are. They're going to say, there's no way we can take the land. It is filled with fortified cities, and the people there are far too strong. So they refuse to enter the land, and they conspire even to return to Egypt. Look at this. Scroll down to this narrative here where the people say, they grumble against Moses and Aaron, and they say, oh, would that we have died in the land of Egypt. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back? Hey, guys, let's go back. Forget about Moses and Aaron. Let's get a new leader, turn around and go right back to Egypt and beg for them to take us back as their slaves. I mean, this is the epitome of an anti-Exodus story. Well, you know what's interesting about this story? So the text specifies for us the exact reason why the people fear the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. It says, the spies say that we saw in the land the Nephilim, sons of Anak, and compared to them, we seemed ourselves like grasshoppers. Now, you remember who the Nephilim are when they're introduced in Genesis chapter 6 as like this demon human hybrid? Well, if that's the case, then it seems as if this rebellion here in Kadesh Barnea in chapter 13 and 14, it's as if it's being set on analogy to Adam's rebellion against this spiritual force in the garden and his own failure. Let me show you what I mean. So the people of Israel, they are kind of described as like a new Adam and Eve. That's what chapters 1 through 10 are establishing. This is a new Adam and Eve. They're living in the garden, and they're going to the even greater garden here in the promised land. And their job, just like Adam's job, is to subdue the chaos in the land, to crush the serpent. That's what Adam should have done. He should have crushed the serpent when he started speaking to Eve, and thereby become a agent of blessing in the garden and beyond. But the question here in chapters 13 and 14 is, how is Israel going to respond to the inhabitant of the land, the promised land? There's someone living there already, and it's this weird spiritual creature, the Nephilim. Just like there's a serpent who is inhabiting the garden. How is Adam going to respond to that serpent? How is Israel going to respond to that serpent in the land? And what are they going to do with the fruit? Are they going to take the fruit? This time they're supposed to. They're supposed to go in the land and take the fruit. But rather, they listen to the inhabitants of the land, just like Adam listened to the snake, and they turn around and are exiled from the land as Adam was. And God tells us that this failure here in chapter 14 is a failure of faith. Let me show you the moment where that connection is made. This is a faith failure. And obviously, faith and belief is a critical word in the Bible, New Testament and Old Testament, where Yahweh is going to ask this question to Moses: how long will the people despise me? How long will they not believe in me in spite of all of the signs and the wonders that I have done before them? They have not believed. Now, the New Testament authors, they have the same Old Testament that we did. They're flipping through, they're reading the book of Numbers, and take a look at how the author of Hebrews, how he reads this story. Let's jump to Hebrews chapter 3. And he's going to use this story and Psalm 95, a reflection on this story, to warn his own readers. And he's going to say to them, beware lest there be in you an evil, unbelieving heart. This is about belief. This is about faith, causing you to fall away from the living God. Do not harden your hearts as in the day of rebellion, as on the day of testing there in the wilderness. The day of testing. This moment here in the center of the rebellion, chiasm, it is a day of testing. And we're told it is one of 10 different days of testing, 10 different tests in the wilderness. Let me show you where I get this number 10, a day of testing, one of 10. Let's jump back to Numbers chapter 14. This time we're going to scroll down to verse 22, where Yahweh says that none of this generation who saw my glory and my signs is going to enter the promised land. For they put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice. And a line like that, man, it just begs you. You got to start counting. Man, was there 10 rebellions? I don't know. Let me go back. Flip back to the book of Exodus. Look in Leviticus. Are there 10 of them? Turns out there are, but there are a couple different ways for you to count these 10. Now, one methodology says you need to find 10 tests before this statement in chapter 14. You gotta count to 10. And if you do that, you can count these 10 different rebellion stories, the last of which is here in chapter 14. Another methodology says, you know what, we're just going to look for 10 tests throughout the entire wilderness period. It's going to go up to and beyond chapter 14, where the test number 14 or 10 is actually going to happen here in Numbers chapter 21. And personally, I kind of like this second approach better because it seems to be a little bit arbitrary to me to take the rebellion in Exodus 16, which is about the manna, and it's going to break it up into 3 separate rebellions. I'm like, I don't like that too much. I like that to be a single rebellion describing all of these responses from the people to the manna given them. Anyways, the people rebel against Yahweh 10 times in the wilderness. But nevertheless, whatever interpretation you approach, whether this is rebellion number 7 or number 10, the judgment is very significant. Israel, as the new Adam and Eve, were invited to return to the Garden of Eden in the Promised Land. But because they refused to do so, God is going to give them what they wanted. You didn't want to go into the land? Fine. You're not going to enter the land. You're going to die in the wilderness. You're going to be exiled as Adam was. And wander there in the desert for 40 years. Now, all of those 40 years are going to be recorded here in the book of Numbers. Everything slowed down to a halt in the book of Leviticus. The time period described in this book is only 30 days. It's a month. They're a month. Moses is receiving commandments from the Lord in the book of Leviticus. But here in Numbers, we have all of those 40 days, 40 years described in this book. However, the author of Numbers, Moses, he's going to concentrate on just a few months in year number 2 and a few more months in year number 40, leaving a massive gap of 38 years, which take place between chapter 19 and chapter 20. And those 38 years are summarized in just, I think it's 18 different campsites, which are recorded in Numbers chapter 33. Take a look at this little chronology chart that we have prepared for you here. So here is the 40 years in the wilderness, and the vast majority of this time is we don't have any unique narratives describing this period. The time is focused here on the 2nd year and on the 40th year, jumping from chapter 19 to chapter 20, right over these 38 years, which are just a handful of campsites. And the silence that we have as to what happened during those 38 years seems to testify that these were in fact wasted years for that first generation, which refused to believe in God's promise. Well, let's turn our attention now from this center narrative to the narratives just outside of it, the rebellion against Israel's leaders, here in chapter 12 and chapter 16 to 17. Well, Miriam is going to Miriam and Aaron together are going to speak against Moses, and they are going to say, has Yahweh spoken only through Moses? Has not Yahweh also spoken through us? What's so special about you, Moses? God uses us as his instruments as well. Well, the sons of Korah, down here in chapter 16, they're going to ask a very similar question. Take a look at how they phrase their kind of rebellion. Let's jump back here to rebellion against leaders. Korah is going to, gather himself and others together, and they're going to speak against Moses and Aaron in particular, and say, "Hey, everyone in the congregation is holy. This is a kingdom of priests. Remember? Why then do you, Aaron, and your sons as priests, why do you exalt yourself above the rest of us?" Well, following this, we have a focus on anger. Yahweh is going to be angry against Miriam and Aaron, and then Moses is going to be angry against Korah and his relatives and those whom he gathers together in rebellion against the priests. And then following this, we have a very public reaffirmation of the leader, where Miriam, she's going to be publicly shamed for 7 days. And then Aaron's staff is going to bud. It's going to sprout almond blossom. So everyone's going to see, oh, Yahweh has chosen Aaron and not the rest of us. And then the ground, of course, just before this in chapter 16, the ground is going to open up and swallow Korah and his family. And you remember, Korah is a Levite, just like Miriam and Aaron. They're Levites. And what's curious about this is Levites, you remember from our study of chapters 1 through 10, they are focused and emphasized in a very strong and positive way in these opening chapters. We spent a lot of time talking about the Levites and their role in Israel. But then we turn the page to chapters 11 to 21, and it seems as if we are witnessing their fall narrative or their fall narratives. It's as if chapters 1 through 10 set the Levites up in this like Adam slot, Adam and Eve slot, where they are the priests. They have access to God's special presence, but then they are going to fail just like Adam failed here in these chapters specifically. Well, this failure of Israel's leaders, and the Levites in particular, it's going to resume kind of a macro pattern that we observed from the book of Exodus, summarized in Paul's words in the book of Galatians, where he says that the law was added because of transgression. More transgression from Israel resulted in more laws. Oh, they're going to transgress again? We need more and more laws. And that's the pattern that we see in Exodus, Leviticus, and now here in Numbers. Their rebellion proves that they need an ever more strict and rigid system of laws to keep their rebellious hearts in check. Take a look at how each of these stories is going to be followed with more laws. So scroll down here. We remember that chiasm we've been developing, where we have rebellion story, laws, rebellion story, laws, about sacrifices, about unintentional sins, tassels on your garment, provisions for the Levites, the red heifer purification, ashes. Aren't those curious? Well, these laws, as random as they feel, they are actually intimately related and connected to the rebellion narratives which preceded them. So, for example, what happened here in chapter 14? But a full generation, everyone recorded in the first census in chapter 1, they will die in the wilderness. And I'm sure that there are some people who are questioning, man, are we ever going to get into the promised land? We've just been told we're all going to die out here. I know that Yahweh said the second generation is going to enter the land, but really? They need some assurance, and they're given some assurance here in chapter 15. Take a look at this. So God promises judgment against the people, and then we have this random set of laws. But is it really random? Look how it opens. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I know that I told you that the first generation is going to die in the wilderness, and they will, but he's speaking to the second generation now, and look what he says. When you young ones, come into the land that you are to inhabit. This is what your sacrifices are to look like. Every lamb, ram, and bull that you bring, it must have a corresponding grain and drink offering with it. But again, the focus is when you come into the land that I will give you. There is grace in the midst of judgment here. God is going to reassert his promise. And then chapter 18, looking at the next batch of laws, 18 and 19, it's going to open in a rather curious way. So every other instance where Yahweh is going to speak through Moses, it's going to say, and the Lord said to Moses, and he said, saying, but here in chapter 18, it doesn't say the Lord spoke to Moses. It says, and Yahweh spoke to Aaron, saying, and he gives him a very specific command. Or communication, revelation. Look what he says. I'm going to jump to chapter 18 here. So the Lord said to Aaron and to your sons. Let's look at verse 5. And you shall keep guard, there's that word again, keep guard over the sanctuary, the tabernacle, over the altar, that there may never again be wrath on the people of Israel. And in verse 3, keep guard over the tent, so that people do not come near to the tent lest they die. Now, what just happened in chapter 16? But the sons of Korah were demanding to come near into the tent, just like priests do, and offer their censer of incense in God's presence in the holy place. But God says that cannot happen. So he's reaffirming his choice of the priests as those who will enter into his presence in the tabernacle and offer incense before him. So that wrath does not go out against the people again, and God doesn't open up the ground again and swallow some more people who are demanding to be leaders like those who God has specially appointed to be so. But then, in a startling reaffirmation of the Levites, the same Levites who were shunned here and shamed, God is going to provide in chapter 18 a special provision for the Levites, where he says here, I have set aside the tithe for you. The tithe of the people, it goes to you, Levites. You still have a very important role here in my presence, even if it's not in the holy place. Well, here in chapter 16, it is Aaron who is the one who's going to intercede for the people. He has his censer of incense, and he's going to run in front of the people. There's a wave of people dying. It's a plague. And it says that where Aaron stood, he stood between the dead and the living. He's going to provide atonement for the people in that way. But that is not typical in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Moses is the standard intercessor in the Torah, not Aaron. He is called on to pray and to avert judgment 3 times here in these rebellion narratives. Take a look here at this chart. Now, this is actually a chart that was developed by Tim Mackey. We see 3 instances of Moses praying and interceding for the people. And interestingly, here in the center, I want to focus on this center story again. Moses is going to repeat his intercessory strategy that he used after the golden calf narrative in Exodus 32, repeating the exact same arguments in favor of Yahweh restraining his judgment. And he's going to repeat back to God God's own self-description of his character, saying, Yahweh, you told me that you are slow to anger, you are abounding in steadfast love, and you forgive iniquity. So please, here and now, forgive the iniquity of your rebellious people. Well, Moses' intercession, it is grounded in a unique intimacy that he has with Yahweh. So back to chapter 12, when Yahweh condemns Miriam, he's going to affirm Moses with these words, and they're powerful. Look at this. In chapter 12, Yahweh's affirmation of Moses' leadership. He says to Miriam and to Moses, if there's a prophet among you, I make myself known to him, but I use visions, I use dreams, but not with Moses. He is faithful. With him, with Moses, I speak mouth to mouth. I speak clearly, not in riddles. And he, Moses, look at this, he beholds the form of Yahweh. Isn't that amazing? That is incredible. Moses had a unique intimacy with Yahweh. But notwithstanding his intimacy and his intercession, chapters 11 and 20 are going to record a tragic impatience of Moses. It seems that throughout all of Exodus, Leviticus, these early chapters of Numbers, Moses has just been totally in sync with the will of Yahweh. It's been a beautiful thing to behold. But here in the book of Numbers, that intimacy with Yahweh, it seems like we're beginning to see some cracks in the armor. So after the rebellion and the grumbling of the people here in chapter 11, Moses' response to the people is rather startling. Take a look at this. Moses' impatience. Here in chapter 11. Remember how wonderful we had it back in Egypt. Moses was displeased. Of course, he should be displeased. And look what he said. Moses says to Yahweh, why have you, Yahweh, why have you dealt ill with me, your servant. Why do you lay this burden of the people on me? I'm not able to carry them. They're too heavy. You know what, Yahweh, if you're going to treat me this way, kill me at once. He sounds just like that whiner Jonah. Kill me at once. And if I find favor in your sight, kill me, so that I may not see my own wretchedness, he says. And this complaint, this impatience is only going to get worse in chapter 20, where the people demand water. And look what Moses says. He says to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we," that is me and Aaron, "shall we bring water for you out of the rock?" No acknowledgement of Yahweh's role in that miracle. Shall we bring water from the rock? And then Moses is going to lift up his hand and he's going to strike the rock, when he was explicitly told by Yahweh to speak to the rock. But he doesn't do that. He lashes out instead. And notice the parallel between the lack of faith of Moses. And we need to jump back to that passage one more time, just so we can see Yahweh's evaluation of Moses' action here, where it says, "Because you did not believe in me," Moses, "you did not believe in me or uphold my name as holy in the sight of the people." Notice this parallel between Moses' lack of faith here in chapter 20. It says, "You did not believe in me, Moses," and the lack of faith that the people exhibit in chapter 14. In both instances, we have a lack of faith, and then people being told that you will not enter into the promised land. Moses is told, "You're not going to enter the promised land, Moses. You're going to die in the wilderness, just like the people." And following this is a defeat by their enemies. Here in chapter 14, the people, even though they're told don't go into the land, they go anyways, and they're defeated by the Amalekites. Just like in chapter 20, after Moses' faithlessness and then judgment of not going into the land, the people are defeated by the Edomites, where Moses is going to send a representative to Edom and say, "Can we pass through your land? We just want to walk right through on the King's Highway. We won't take anything, we promise. We're on our way up to Moab." And the Edomites refuse them passage. And look what it costs them. Because, let's jump to this picture. So here from Kadesh, this is where they sent the spies in. But then all those years later, they attempt to pass through the land of Edom to go up to Moab here. But Edom says no. They are defeated, and they're forced to go all the way down and around from the east. Well, both of these accounts, these critical chapters in chapter 11 and 20, they are going to testify to Israel's need of a different form of leadership. Israel needs to be led by the Spirit. That's the point that these chapters are making. Because after Moses says, "Oh, I'm not able to carry the weight of this people," God says, "Okay, fine, you won't. Let me take some of your spirit and put that spirit on 70 elders who will share this responsibility with you." And then down in chapter 20, when we're told, "Moses, you can't go into the land," we read forward a few chapters in chapter 27 that Moses is going to be replaced by Joshua. And Joshua is a man who was filled with the Spirit. So what we need is not an individual like Moses, but we need the leadership of God's own Spirit. And take a look at how John Sailhammer, how he interprets these connections. I think he does a great job explaining this for us. Let's jump down and read his quote. "The central purpose of this narrative here in chapter 11, Moses' own failure, is the fact that he failed in his office as a mediator. And by means of various parts of this narrative, the kind of leadership which is exhibited by Moses is placed alongside the role of the Spirit." So we got Moses, we got Spirit. We got Moses, we got Spirit. And the ideal leadership of God's people is shown in the example of the 70 elders who are Spirit-filled. In other words, this narrative shows that Moses himself longed for a much different type of community than the one formed under the law. Moses longed for a community led not by a person like himself, but rather by a community guided by God's Spirit. Now, if we take a look here at chapter 11, we can see that Moses himself, he's like, what we need is the Spirit to be on all people. He says, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that the Lord's people were all prophets, and that everyone in Israel would be filled with God's Spirit. Well, this message of the need for God's Spirit to inhabit God's people is taught in subtle ways all through the Torah. Look especially at Deuteronomy chapter 30. And that is because the entire Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it is all designed as a single literary whole. And it's designed with a literary brilliance such that the last book, Deuteronomy, matches in some very important ways the first book, Genesis. And then the book of Numbers here, it's going to match in important ways the book of Exodus. And of course, Leviticus is there at the very center. Now take a look at how the book of Numbers is designed to mirror the book of Exodus on the other side of Sinai. Take a look at this. So we have this little Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers chiasm. This is fascinating, where Israel is going to be at Egypt initially. They're going to wander through the wilderness to Sinai. They'll be at Sinai for a year, then they're going to go through the wilderness again, and then they're going to end on the plains of Moab. And specifically, in this moment, I want to focus on how the wilderness experience, the initial one, as they go from Egypt to Sinai, is going to match precisely Israel's experience in the wilderness here in the book of Numbers. In each case, right when they enter the wilderness, they're going to sing a song, and then they're going to go a 3-day journey into the wilderness, and then they're going to start grumbling. And the very next grumbling story, Yahweh is going to provide both manna and quail, and then Yahweh is going to provide water from the rock for them. And then at the end, we get the surprising grace of Yahweh defeating first the Amalekites in Exodus 17, and then the Amorites in Numbers 21. Well, what is this? Oh, yeah, and then one more detail. Bracketing Israel's time at Sinai here is this random, totally random appearance of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. And then again, we have this appearance of Jethro. He's going to show up again right before they leave to go into the wilderness, which seems totally out of place until you realize the book of Numbers and its role to mirror the book of Exodus. Now, what are these connections meant to communicate? Well, it seems that what we're demonstrating with these parallels is that Israel is exactly the same after Sinai as they were before Sinai. Now, you'd think that spending a full year in God's presence at Sinai and hearing this direct revelation from him, you'd think that'd have a positive effect on the people. But we're told with this literary precision that the old covenant received at Sinai is not working. There is something fundamentally flawed with Israel and with the human heart. What we need and what Israel needs is a new covenant, a covenant that is characterized by the Spirit of God and by his grace. A surprising grace which shows up in chapter 21. God is going to lavish Israel with an undeserved grace here in this chapter, because in chapter 20, and deservingly so, everybody's dying. Chapter 20 opens with the death of Miriam, and then in the middle of the chapter, Moses is told, hey, you're going to die in the wilderness. You're not getting in the promised land. And then at the end of chapter 20, Aaron dies. He's told, go up to Mount Hor and die on that mountain. But then in chapter 21, it is just filled with these unexpected reversals. 3 times Israel is granted victory over their enemies. And the first of those victories happens at a place called Hormah. And that is exactly where Israel was defeated here in chapter 14, where they were defeated by the Amalekites. So here in chapter 21, God is taking a place of defeat and he is transforming it into a place of victory. And this grace is just a foretaste for the grand reversal here at the heart of the book of Numbers in chapters 22 to 25, which we will take a look at next.